The journal lay open in Eleanor's weathered hands, its leather binding cracked like dried earth. She sat on the cellar steps, squinting at Jeremiah Thorne's spidery handwriting in the dim light filtering through the basement's single window. Frank's footsteps creaked overhead as he explored the upper floors of their impossible inheritance. October 15th, she read aloud to herself, her librarian's instincts automatically noting the date was exactly 3 months ago. The corn's talking again, whispering things I don't want to hear. Martha always said I was too sensitive, but Martha's been gone 5 years now, and the voices haven't stopped. If anything, they're getting clearer. Eleanor's throat tightened. She'd spent decades helping patrons research genealogy, parsing through birth certificates and property records. But this felt different, personal, invasive, like reading someone's final confession. She turned the page, her fingers trembling slightly. The weather from the cellar's chill or something deeper, she couldn't say. October 18th. Found another letter today, slipped under the door while I was sleeping. Same handwriting as the others, same message, the Whitmores are coming home. How do they know? I never told anyone about Eleanor's grandmother, about what really happened to the Whitmore family in 1883. Some secrets are supposed to stay buried. The journal slipped from Eleanor's hands, clattering against the wooden steps. Whitmore, her maiden name. Her grandmother had died when Eleanor was barely 3 years old. A woman she knew only through a handful of faded photographs and her mother's reluctant stories about the old country troubles that had driven the family east. Ellie? Frank's voice drifted down from the kitchen. You okay down there? You've been awfully quiet. She picked up the journal with shaking hands. Just looking through some old papers. Be up in a minute. But she couldn't move, couldn't stop reading. October 22nd. They're in the corn every night now, moving between the rows like they're following paths only they can see. I tried to photograph them, but the camera just shows empty fields. Sarah from the church called again about the raffle. Says she's mailed the tickets to Eleanor Whitmore in Connecticut. Says it came to her in a dream, clear as day. The address, the need to make sure Eleanor got those tickets. God's work, she called it. But I've seen God's work, and this feels like something else entirely. Eleanor's chest constricted. Sarah, the woman who'd called 3 weeks ago with that sweet grandmotherly voice, insisting the raffle tickets had been purchased in Eleanor and Frank's name. A church donation, she'd said, from a distant relative who'd wanted to remain anonymous. October 25th. The watchers came right up to the porch tonight. I could see them through the kitchen window, tall figures in clothes that looked like they belonged to another century. They stood there for hours, patient as stones, facing the house like they were waiting for permission to enter. When dawn came, they were gone, but they left something behind, footprints in the dirt that looked old, older than they should have been, and underneath them, the faint outline of other prints, smaller ones, a woman's shoes maybe, leading right up to the front door. The basement suddenly felt smaller, the shadows deeper. Eleanor forced herself to breathe steadily, the way she had during her anxiety attacks in the months after retirement. Logic, facts, evidence. Those were the tools that had guided her through 4 decades of helping people solve their research puzzles. But this journal was presenting her with a puzzle that defied every reasonable explanation. Ellie? Frank's footsteps approached the cellar door. I found something up here you need to see. In the bedroom closet, she flipped to the final entry, dated just 2 days before Jeremiah's disappearance. October 30th. It's time. They've been waiting 40 years for the right people to come home, and Eleanor's grandmother made a promise that needs keeping. I've done my part, maintained the land, kept the corn growing. But I was never meant to stay forever. Just a caretaker until the real inheritors arrived. Eleanor doesn't know yet what she's inherited, what she'll be expected to do. The debt runs deeper than land or money. It's written in blood and soil and promises made during the hardest winter Nebraska ever saw. God help her. God help them both. But maybe God stopped listening to this place a long time ago. Eleanor slammed the journal shut, her heart hammering against her ribs. Above her head, Frank's footsteps had stopped moving. The house had gone completely silent, except for the soft whisper of wind through the corn outside. Frank? She called, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. She climbed the cellar steps on unsteady legs, the journal clutched against her chest. The kitchen was empty, but the back door stood wide open, revealing endless rows of corn that swayed despite the absence of any breeze. And there, just visible in the afternoon shadows between the stalks, something moved with deliberate, patient purpose. Something that had been waiting a very long time for Eleanor Whitmore to come home. "Frank!" Eleanor's voice cracked as she called into the empty kitchen. The back door gaped open like a wound, framing the restless corn that moved without wind. She clutched Jeremiah's journal tighter, its leather binding slick with perspiration from her palms. The movement between the stalks had stopped. Whatever had been waiting there seemed to have melted back into the golden maze, leaving only the endless whisper of leaves and Eleanor's ragged breathing. "Up here, Ellie." Frank's voice drifted down from the second floor, steady and reassuring. "Normal. You need to see this." Eleanor's knees nearly buckled with relief. She forced herself to cross the kitchen and close the back door, turning the lock with trembling fingers. The simple click of metal against metal felt like armor against whatever lurked in the corn. She found Frank in the master bedroom, standing before an open closet that revealed neat rows of men's clothing. Work shirts, overalls, a single black suit that looked decades old. But it was what he held in his hands that made Eleanor's breath catch. "Look at this," Frank said, extending a wooden box toward her. It was hidden behind those clothes, along with some other things. The box was filled with photographs, old ones in sepia tones and faded color. Eleanor recognized some of the faces from her own family albums, distant relatives she'd seen in her mother's careful documentation of their genealogy. But there were others, too, strangers who somehow didn't feel strange at all. "Frank, I found something too." She held up the journal. "Jeremiah Thorne kept records, about us, about my family. He knew we were coming." Frank's weathered face creased with concern. At 72, he'd developed the patience that came with age, but Eleanor could see the worry building in his pale blue eyes. After 45 years of marriage, she knew his expressions better than her own. What kind of records? Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed they would supposedly sleep in tonight, though that prospect seemed increasingly unlikely. She opened the journal to a random page, scanning Jeremiah's cramped handwriting. He writes about watchers in the corn, about some kind of debt my family owes. "Ellie, sweetheart." Frank sat beside her, his calloused hand finding hers. "You know what this sounds like, don't you?" She did know. The same thing it would have sounded like to any of the patrons who'd come to the Millbrook Public Library over the years, spinning tales about mysterious inheritances and family curses. The kind of stories Eleanor had gently steered toward the fiction section while helping them research their actual genealogy. But that had been her world, the orderly universe of card catalogs and reference desks, where every question had an answer if you just knew where to look, where the most mysterious thing in her day was tracking down an overdue book or helping someone decipher their great-grandmother's handwriting. "Frank, what if we just went home?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "Right now. Pack up, drive back to Connecticut, pretend this never happened." The silence stretched between them. Outside, the corn rustled with that impossible wind. "What home?" Frank asked finally, his voice gentle but pointed. "The apartment we can barely afford since I retired? Sitting in front of the television every night because we're too tired to do anything else?" Eleanor's chest tightened. He was right, of course. Their life in Connecticut had shrunk to the size of a one-bedroom apartment and a fixed income that dwindled a little more each month. She'd spent 6 months after retirement reorganizing their closets, trying to fill the hours that had once been occupied by work. Frank's pension from the Postal Service covered their basic needs, but there were no vacations, no dinners out, no cushion for emergencies. "We could sell this place," she said, though even as she spoke, she knew it wasn't that simple. "Use the money to get a better apartment, maybe something with a garden." Frank picked up one of the photographs from the box, a formal portrait of a woman who looked remarkably like Eleanor around the eyes. "Could we? Do we even know who to contact about a sale?" The legal papers we got in the mail didn't mention any realty company or law firm, just that we'd inherited the property. Eleanor remembered the envelope that had arrived 2 weeks after the raffle drawing. Official-looking documents that proclaimed them the legal owners of the Thorne farm, effective immediately. No lawyers, no probate court, no complications. At the time, it had seemed like a miracle. Now it felt like a trap. 43 years, Frank said quietly. That's how long we've been talking about having land. A garden bigger than a window box, space to breathe. Eleanor closed her eyes, remembering all those conversations. Sunday drives through Connecticut farmland, pointing out properties they'd never be able to afford. Frank's careful sketches of garden layouts that would never see soil, the dreams that had sustained them through decades of cramped city living. But not like this, she whispered, clutching the journal. Not with conditions we don't understand. Frank's arms settled around her shoulders, solid and warm. Then maybe it's time we figured out what those conditions are. The sound came at dusk, a low, rhythmic knocking that seemed to emerge from the very walls of the farmhouse. Eleanor froze at the kitchen sink where she'd been washing their dinner dishes, the plate slipping from her soapy hands and clattering against the porcelain. "Frank," she whispered, though he was already moving toward the front of the house, his footsteps careful and measured. The knocking came again. 3 deliberate raps, followed by silence, then 3 more. Not the casual knock of a neighbor or the urgent hammering of someone in distress. This was ceremonial, patient, like whoever stood on their porch had all the time in the world. Eleanor dried her hands on the dish towel, her eyes fixed on the back door she'd locked hours earlier. Through the window, the corn had taken on an ominous quality in the fading light, the stalks appearing almost black against the purple sky. And there, between the rows, she could swear she saw movement again, shapes that seemed to drift rather than walk. "Ellie?" Frank's voice carried a note she'd rarely heard in their decades together. Uncertainty, fear. There's no one here." She found him standing in the open front doorway, staring out at an empty porch. The evening air drifted past him, carrying the smell of rich earth and something else, something old and organic, like leaves that had been composting for decades. "But we both heard—" "I know what we heard." Frank's hand gripped the doorframe. "But look." Eleanor peered past him. The porch was indeed empty, but there on the weathered boards lay something that hadn't been there before. A manila envelope, thick with papers, placed precisely in the center of the welcome mat. Neither of them moved to retrieve it. "More legal documents?" Frank asked, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it. Eleanor's mouth had gone dry. "There's no postmark. No delivery truck came up the drive." The envelope sat there like a challenge, like a test they couldn't avoid taking. In the distance, a sound drifted across the fields. Not quite wind, not quite voices, but something that made the hair on Eleanor's arms stand on end. Finally, Frank stepped onto the porch and bent to collect the envelope. His movements were stiff, reluctant, like a man who knew he was making a mistake but couldn't see any alternative. Back inside, with the door firmly locked and the curtains drawn, they sat at the kitchen table while Frank carefully opened the envelope. Inside were photocopied pages, old newspaper clippings, handwritten letters, and what appeared to be excerpts from historical records. Eleanor adjusted her reading glasses and began to scan the documents. The first was a newspaper clipping from the Nebraska State Journal, dated November 15, 1883. Local family vanishes during blizzard. The Whitmore homestead, located 12 miles southeast of Lincoln, was found abandoned following the unprecedented storm that swept through Lancaster County this week. Jeremiah Whitmore, his wife Sarah, and their 3 children appear to have left in the middle of the night, leaving behind all their possessions and livestock. Neighbors report seeing lights in the cornfields on the night of their disappearance, though the storm would have made such activity extremely dangerous. Eleanor's vision blurred. "Frank, this is about my family. My great-great-grandfather." The next document was a handwritten letter, the ink faded but still legible. "My dearest sister Margaret, I write this from Council Bluffs as we prepare to journey east. I cannot tell you what transpired on the farm, only that we are bound by an agreement that must pass to our children's children. The land will call them back when the time comes. I pray it will not be in our lifetime, but if Eleanor's line returns to Nebraska, they must know that what was promised must be honored. The harvest feeds more than just the living. Your devoted brother, Jeremiah Whitmore. Eleanor's line, Frank repeated slowly. He's talking about you specifically. By name. The final document was a property deed, dated just 3 months ago, the day before Jeremiah Thorne's disappearance. It showed the transfer of the farm from Thorne to the rightful inheritors of the Whitmore covenant. At the bottom, in Jeremiah Thorne's careful handwriting, was a single line. My stewardship is complete. May God have mercy on what comes next. Eleanor pushed back from the table, her chair scraping against the linoleum. This isn't possible. People don't just orchestrate their lives around events that happened over a century ago. But even as she said it, she thought about the raffle tickets that had arrived unbidden, the woman named Sarah who'd claimed divine inspiration, the way everything had fallen into place with impossible smoothness. No legal complications, no competing claims, no bureaucratic delays. As if the universe itself had been clearing a path for their arrival. Frank gathered the papers with trembling hands. Ellie, we have a choice to make. We can leave right now, drive back to Connecticut tonight, and pretend this never happened. And if we stay, then we find out what your ancestors promised, what this debt actually means. Outside, the knocking began again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the front porch. It was coming from everywhere at once. The walls, the windows, the very foundation of the house. Like the entire farm was demanding an answer. Eleanor looked at her husband of 45 years, saw her own fear reflected in his eyes, and realized their ordinary world had just died forever. The knocking faded into silence, but the echo seemed to reverberate through Eleanor's bones. She remained frozen at the kitchen table, staring at the documents that had rewritten her family history in a matter of minutes. Frank's hand covered hers, warm and familiar, but even his touch couldn't anchor her to the world she thought she knew. We should go, she whispered. Right now. Pack our things and drive through the night. But her voice lacked conviction, and they both knew it. The rational part of her mind, the librarian who had spent decades helping people separate fact from fiction, kept circling back to the evidence. The newspaper clipping with its precise date, the letter written in her ancestor's hand, the property deed that seemed to have orchestrated itself. What if we can't leave? The question slipped out before she could stop it, voicing the fear that had been growing in her chest since they'd first stepped foot on the property. Frank's grip tightened on her hand. What do you mean? Eleanor gestured toward the darkened windows. Think about it, Frank. The car wouldn't start properly when we arrived. The GPS lost signal for the last 10 miles. Even our cell phones barely work out here. She paused, remembering how their ordinary Tuesday had transformed into something impossible. What if none of that was coincidence? The house settled around them with a soft groan, as if it were listening. Eleanor found herself studying the kitchen with new eyes. The way the shadows seemed deeper than they should be. How the wallpaper pattern appeared to shift when she wasn't looking directly at it. Even the refrigerator's hum sounded somehow expectant. Ellie, you're scaring yourself. Frank's voice carried the gentle authority he'd developed over 4 decades of talking her through her anxious spirals. We're tired. It's been an overwhelming day. Things always seem worse at night. But even as he spoke, Eleanor could see the doubt in his eyes. Frank had always been the practical one, the man who fixed leaky faucets and balanced their checkbook and approached problems with methodical patience. If he was questioning reality, then reality was truly fractured. I keep thinking about our old life, Eleanor said, surprising herself with the admission. That tiny apartment, your back pain from the old postal truck, the way we had to check our bank balance before buying groceries. She looked around the spacious kitchen with its solid wooden cabinets and modern appliances. This place could change everything for us, if we survive whatever comes with it. The word hung between them like a physical thing. Survive. It seemed melodramatic, the stuff of horror novels and late-night movies. But Eleanor couldn't shake the memory of those shapes moving through the corn, or the way Jeremiah Thorne's journal had chronicled 40 years of waiting for her specifically to arrive. Maybe the debt isn't what we think, she said, grasping for hope. Maybe it's just maintaining the farm, keeping the land in the family. Frank picked up the letter from her ancestor, reading it again by the kitchen light. Eleanor, this talks about feeding more than just the living. That doesn't sound like property maintenance. She closed her eyes, trying to summon the courage that had carried her through lesser crises. The year Frank had his heart attack, her mother's final illness, the budget cuts that had eliminated her position at the library. But this was different. This reached back through generations to touch something primal, something that predated the ordered world of books and catalogs and rational explanations. What if we stayed just one more day, she heard herself say, to gather more information, make a proper decision. Frank studied her face in the yellow kitchen light. You want to stay? It wasn't a question, and Eleanor couldn't deny it. Beneath her fear, beneath the rational voice screaming at her to run, something deeper was stirring. A sense of connection she'd never felt in their cramped Connecticut apartment, as if the land itself recognized her blood, her bones, her belonging. I've never had a legacy before, she admitted. Never inherited anything more meaningful than my mother's china set. This farm, this history, it's the first thing that's ever been truly mine, even if it comes with conditions we don't understand. Eleanor opened her eyes and met his gaze. Especially then. Frank, what if we spend the rest of our lives wondering what we walked away from? Outside, the corn whispered secrets they couldn't quite hear. The house creaked and settled like an old woman getting comfortable in her favorite chair, and in the distance, so faint it might have been imagination, came the sound of footsteps crossing the fields, measured, patient, inevitable. Frank gathered the documents into a neat pile, his movements careful and deliberate. One more day, he agreed finally, but at the first sign that we're in real danger, we leave, Eleanor finished. I promise. But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if leaving would still be an option by morning. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. The kitchen light flickered once, as if in acknowledgement. The light steadied after its ominous flicker, but Eleanor felt something fundamental shift in that moment, as if her spoken promise to stay, even for just one more day, had triggered some invisible mechanism. The air in the kitchen seemed denser now, charged with possibility and threat in equal measure. Frank stood first, his joints protesting after the long day. We should try to get some sleep. Everything will look different in the morning. But Eleanor remained seated, her fingers still tracing the edges of the mysterious documents. Frank, what if it doesn't? What if morning changes nothing, and we're still trapped in someone else's story? Then we'll face it together. His hand found her shoulder, steady and warm, same as we always have. She wanted to draw comfort from his words, but the weight of decision pressed down on her like a physical thing. Standing up felt like crossing a bridge she could never recross. Every step deeper into the house would take them further from their old life, from the woman who had sorted books and worried about grocery budgets and never imagined inheriting anything more mysterious than Great Aunt Helen's recipe box. But she rose anyway, drawn by forces she couldn't name. They climbed the stairs together, Frank's hand trailing along the banister, while Eleanor noticed details that had escaped her earlier. Family photographs lined the wall, not of the Thornes she realized now, but spanning generations of faces that carried echoes of her own features. A young woman in a Depression-era dress who had Eleanor's stubborn chin, a farmer in overalls whose eyes held Frank's patient kindness. A child who could have been Eleanor's own reflection, if she'd ever had children. My God, she whispered, stopping before a formal portrait dated 1923. Frank, this is my grandmother. I have this exact same photograph in our album back home. But that was impossible. This picture showed her grandmother as a young woman standing in front of the very farmhouse they now occupied. Eleanor's family had never lived in Nebraska. Her grandmother had been born and raised in Connecticut, had married a Connecticut man, had never traveled west of Albany as far as Eleanor knew. The frames look new, Frank observed, his voice carefully neutral. Like someone hung these recently. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Someone had been preparing for their arrival, curating their welcome with photographs that should not exist. The implications made her dizzy. How long had this been planned? How far back did the orchestration reach? They continued down the hall to the master bedroom, where Eleanor had discovered Jeremiah's journal that afternoon. The room felt different now in the lamplight, less like a museum of someone else's life and more like a space that had been waiting patiently for its rightful occupants. Frank sat heavily on the edge of the bed, exhaustion finally claiming him. "Ellie, I need you to listen to me, really listen." She turned from the window where she'd been watching the cornfields ripple in the moonlight. Those movements between the stalks were more obvious now, less subtle. Figures that might have been human if humans could glide rather than walk. "I've been thinking about our old life," Frank continued, his voice low and serious. "Really thinking. And you know what I realized? We were dying there, inch by inch. Not living, just waiting to die. When was the last time either of us felt excited about anything? When did we last take a real risk?" Eleanor's throat tightened. He was right, and they both knew it. Their Connecticut existence had become a careful management of decline, each month bringing smaller pleasures and larger fears about money, health, relevance. "But this isn't a risk, Frank. This is something else entirely. Something that reaches back through generations and demands things we can't understand." "Maybe." He pulled back the covers, revealing sheets that smelled of lavender and sunshine despite the farmhouse having stood empty for months. "But maybe that's exactly what we need. Purpose, legacy, something bigger than ourselves." Eleanor moved to her side of the bed, her movements automatic after 4 decades of shared bedtimes. But nothing about this felt automatic. Every choice, staying for the night, unpacking their suitcase, accepting the reality of their inheritance, felt weighted with consequence. As she changed into her nightgown, she caught her reflection in the dresser mirror. The woman staring back looked older than she had that morning, but also somehow more substantial, more present, as if the act of claiming her inheritance had awakened parts of herself that had been dormant for years. "Frank?" She turned to find him already under the covers, looking smaller and more vulnerable than she'd seen him since his heart attack 5 years earlier. "What if we're not the same people tomorrow? What if staying here changes us in ways we can't undo?" His eyes met hers in the lamplight. "Then maybe that's exactly what's supposed to happen." Eleanor clicked off the lamp, plunging them into darkness broken only by moonlight streaming through unfamiliar windows. Outside, the corn whispered secrets in a language older than words, and somewhere in the distance she could swear she heard humming, a lullaby that tugged at memories she'd never actually lived. She had crossed the threshold. There was no going back. Eleanor woke to silence so complete it felt oppressive. The humming that had lulled her to sleep was gone, replaced by an absence of sound that made her ears ring. No birds chirped outside the windows, no insects buzzed, even the ever-present whisper of cornstalks had stilled. Beside her, Frank's breathing was deep and even, but his face looked troubled in the gray pre-dawn light. She slipped from bed carefully, not wanting to wake him, and padded to the window. The fields stretched endlessly in the weak morning sun, but something was wrong. The corn stood perfectly motionless, as if frozen mid-sway, and there, at the edge of the closest field, a figure stood watching the house. Eleanor's breath caught. It was a woman in a faded blue dress, her hair pinned back in an old-fashioned style. Even from this distance, Eleanor could see the family resemblance, the same stubborn jawline she'd inherited, the same way of holding her shoulders when facing something difficult. The woman raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or a warning, then turned and walked into the corn. The stalks didn't bend or rustle to accommodate her passage. She simply vanished between them like smoke. "Well," Eleanor whispered to herself, "I suppose that settles whether we're dealing with the living or the dead." The admission should have terrified her, but instead she felt an odd sense of relief. At 68, she'd buried her parents, her siblings, most of her closest friends. Death wasn't a stranger anymore. It was simply another country whose customs she'd never learned. She dressed quietly and made her way downstairs, following the scent of coffee that shouldn't have been brewing in an empty kitchen. But there it was, a full pot sitting warm on the counter beside 2 cups and a plate of biscuits that definitely hadn't been there the night before. A folded note lay beside the cups, written in the same flowing script she'd seen in yesterday's mysterious documents. Eleanor, welcome home. There are things you must understand before the sun sets tonight. Follow the path behind the barn when you're ready to learn the rules. You are not alone in this. Sarah. Eleanor's hand trembled as she set down the note. Sarah, the woman from the church who'd insisted they'd won a raffle they'd never entered. But how could she be here? How could she have prepared coffee and biscuits without waking them? Ellie? Frank's voice drifted down from upstairs. Everything all right? Come down when you're dressed, she called back, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. We have a visitor's message, though I'm not sure when it was delivered. 20 minutes later, they sat together at the kitchen table, sharing the mysterious breakfast that tasted like Eleanor's grandmother's recipe, despite coming from a woman they'd met only yesterday. The biscuits were perfect, flaky, buttery, still warm from an oven that showed no signs of recent use. This is impossible, Frank said for the third time, but he kept eating. Everything about this place is impossible. Eleanor sipped her coffee, which was exactly the right strength, exactly the right temperature. But impossible doesn't mean we can ignore it. Frank studied the note again. She wants you to follow a path behind the barn. That sounds like the beginning of every horror story you've ever checked out from the library. Or the beginning of finally getting answers. Eleanor surprised herself with how much she wanted those answers, despite the cost they might carry. Frank, I've spent my entire adult life organizing other people's stories, helping them find the information they needed. I've never been the protagonist of anything more exciting than a budget committee meeting. And now? Now I'm apparently the inheritor of a supernatural legacy that's been orchestrated for over a century. She stood, decision crystallizing. I need to know what that means. Frank caught her hand as she moved toward the door. Then we go together. The note was addressed to me specifically. And we've been married for 45 years. Where you go, I go. His grip tightened. Besides, if something happens to you, I'd rather face it beside you than spend the rest of my life wondering. Eleanor felt a rush of love so fierce it momentarily displaced her fear. Whatever forces had brought them here, whatever price her inheritance demanded, at least she wouldn't pay it alone. They stepped outside together into the unnaturally quiet morning. The path behind the barn was clearly marked now, though Eleanor was certain it hadn't been there yesterday. A line of white stones leading toward a grove of oak trees that seemed to shimmer in the distance like a mirage. Last chance, Frank said quietly. Eleanor looked back at the farmhouse that had somehow become home in less than 24 hours. Then at her husband, whose presence had anchored her through every crisis of their shared life. No, she said. This is our first real chance at something extraordinary. They walked toward the grove together, leaving their ordinary world behind with each step. The white stones beneath their feet seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence that shouldn't have been visible in the morning light. Eleanor counted 37 steps before she stopped counting, her attention drawn instead to the way the air itself felt different here. Thicker, charged with the same electric anticipation that preceded thunderstorms. The temperature's dropping, Frank observed, his breath beginning to mist despite the October warmth they'd left behind at the barn. Eleanor nodded, pulling her cardigan closer. Each step forward took them deeper into what felt like a pocket of winter that existed independent of season or geography. The grove ahead wavered like heat shimmer, though the air around them grew steadily colder. Frank, what if this is a test? The words came out before she'd fully formed the thought. What if how we handle this determines what happens next? Then we handle it together, same as everything else. But his voice carried a tremor she'd rarely heard, and his grip on her hand had tightened to the point of discomfort. As they approached the tree line, Eleanor could see that the grove wasn't natural. The oaks stood in a perfect circle, their branches intertwined overhead to form a living cathedral. At the center, barely visible through the shifting light and shadow, stood a stone table that looked far older than anything else they'd encountered on the farm. This predates the farmhouse by centuries, Eleanor whispered, her librarian's instincts automatically cataloging details. Look at the wear patterns on that stone. This is ancient. A figure emerged from behind one of the massive oaks, Sarah from the church, but not as they'd seen her yesterday. Gone was the cheerful volunteer in her simple dress and practical shoes. This Sarah wore clothing that might have been from any era or no era at all, fabric that seemed to shift between patterns like looking at it through water. Her face held the same kindness, but underneath lay something vast and patient and utterly inhuman. "Eleanor," Sarah said, and her voice carried harmonics that resonated in Eleanor's chest like struck tuning forks. "You came, Frank." She nodded to him with what seemed like genuine warmth. "Your presence here is unexpected, but not unwelcome." "Unexpected?" Frank stepped slightly forward, placing himself between Eleanor and Sarah. "You invited us here. You orchestrated all of this." Sarah's smile held depths that made Eleanor think of looking down a well at midnight. "I extended an invitation that had been written long before any of us were born. Eleanor was always meant to come home. Whether she would bring her heart with her," she gestured to Frank, "remained to be seen." The casual reference to Frank as Eleanor's heart should have been touching, but spoken in Sarah's impossible voice, it sounded more like a clinical observation. As if love itself was simply another variable in an equation Eleanor couldn't begin to understand. "What are we preparing for?" Eleanor heard herself ask, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Your note said there were rules I needed to understand." "Walk with me." Sarah moved toward the stone table at the grove's center, and Eleanor found her feet following, despite every rational instinct screaming at her to run. Frank kept pace beside her, his presence the only anchor to sanity in a situation that had moved far beyond anything resembling normal reality. The table was covered with symbols that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when Eleanor looked directly at them, but at the edges of her vision, she could almost make sense of the patterns: genealogical charts stretching back centuries, astronomical calculations, what might have been architectural plans for structures that couldn't possibly exist in three-dimensional space. "Your family line carries a responsibility," Sarah began, running her fingers over the stone surface. Where she touched, the symbols glowed briefly before fading. "For nearly 200 years, the Whitmore women have served as guardians, protectors of a barrier between what is and what should never be allowed to exist in your world." Eleanor felt Frank's hand tighten in hers. "What kind of barrier?" "The kind that requires feeding." Sarah's eyes met Eleanor's, and in them, Eleanor saw centuries of women who had stood where she now stood, faced the same impossible choice. "The land here is thin, Eleanor. The boundaries between worlds grow weak without constant reinforcement. Your great-great-grandmother, Sarah, my namesake, was the last to properly maintain the covenant. Since her death, others have tried to hold the line, but the blood calls to blood. The responsibility can only truly be carried by family." The implications hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Jeremiah Thorne. He wasn't the real owner, was he? He was just maintaining things until I arrived. 40 years he held the line as best he could, growing older and more frightened with each passing season. The barriers weakened under his care. Things began to slip through that should have remained locked away. Sarah's voice carried genuine sadness. "He knew you would come eventually. The land itself called to you, drew you here when the time was right." Frank's voice cut through the supernatural explanation with practical concern. "And if Eleanor refuses? If we walk away right now?" Sarah's smile faded entirely. "Then the barriers collapse completely, and what has been held back for 2 centuries pours into your world like water through a broken dam." Eleanor stared at the shifting symbols on the stone table, understanding finally why she'd felt such an immediate connection to this place. Not just inheritance, responsibility. Legacy measured not in acres or dollars, but in the weight of keeping ancient horrors at bay. "Show me," she said quietly. "Show me what I'm really protecting." Sarah nodded, and the grove around them began to change. The transformation began subtly, shadows deepening between the oak trees despite the morning sun, the temperature plummeting until Eleanor's breath came in sharp white puffs. Then the grove itself started to shift, the ancient stone table sinking into earth that rippled like water, the circle of trees expanding outward as if viewed through a lens being slowly adjusted. "What you're about to see," Sarah said, her voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere, "is why your bloodline has borne this burden for 8 generations." The world tilted. Eleanor felt Frank's hand in hers, his solid presence the only constant as reality folded around them like origami made of space and time. The grove dissolved, replaced by something that made her mind recoil in self-defense. They stood at the edge of a vast chasm that shouldn't exist in rural Nebraska, couldn't exist anywhere in the rational world she'd inhabited for 68 years. The pit stretched beyond sight, its walls carved with the same shifting symbols from the stone table but magnified 1,000-fold. And from its depths came sounds that no human throat could produce, keening wails that spoke of hunger older than civilization, of intelligence that had watched the rise and fall of species with predatory patience. "Dear God," Frank whispered, and Eleanor felt him sway beside her. But it wasn't the chasm that truly terrified her. It was what moved within it. Shapes that defied description writhed in the darkness below, forms that her brain kept trying to categorize as familiar things. Serpents, trees, human figures, before rejecting each comparison as inadequate. They pressed against barriers she couldn't see, creating ripples in the air itself, testing every inch of their prison with methodical persistence. "The old ones," Sarah's voice explained from the transformed grove. "They ruled this continent before the first human migration, before your species learned to chip flint or speak in words. When they fell, it was not to death, but to imprisonment. The barriers that contain them require constant renewal, constant sacrifice of will and energy and life force itself." Eleanor watched one of the creatures surge upward, its form shifting between phases of matter. For a moment, just a moment, it pressed against the invisible ceiling of its prison directly below her feet. She felt its attention fix on her like the weight of a falling star. And in that instant of contact, knowledge poured into her mind. It knew her name, it knew her bloodline. It had been waiting. "The watchers in the corn," she gasped, finally understanding Jeremiah's journal entries. "They're not the enemy, they're the guards. Remnants of the binding spell," Sarah confirmed. "Echoes of every guardian who has fed her life force into maintaining the prison. Your great-great-grandmother Sarah still walks these fields, as will you when your time comes. The responsibility passes from mother to daughter, but it never truly ends." Frank's voice came strained with horror. "How many people know about this?" "None. Knowledge of the Old One's existence must remain contained, or fear alone would weaken the barriers. Only the Guardian and her closest companions can bear this weight." Eleanor felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Not her heart, but something deeper. The comfortable predictability of her former life, the safe routine of library books and afternoon tea, fell away like a discarded coat. In its place rose an understanding that felt both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. She had spent decades helping others find information, organize knowledge, solve small problems. This was the same skill set applied to a problem of cosmic magnitude. "How much time do I have?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. The chasm began to fade as Sarah guided their perception back toward the grove, but Eleanor could feel it now, an enormous presence beneath her feet, pressing upward against bonds that grew weaker with each passing moment. "The barriers are failing faster than they ever have," Sarah admitted, as the oak trees reformed around them, the stone table rising from earth that had never moved. Jeremiah managed perhaps 6 months between renewal rituals in his final years. "You may have weeks." Eleanor looked at Frank, seeing her own transformation reflected in his face. He was terrified, but he wasn't running. After 45 years of marriage, she could read the decision forming behind his eyes with perfect clarity. "What exactly does renewal require?" Eleanor asked. Sarah's expression grew infinitely sad. "A portion of your life force, freely given. Each ritual ages you, Eleanor. Your great-great-grandmother appeared to be 90 when she died at 57. The barriers demand more from each generation as the old ones grow stronger in their imprisonment." Eleanor felt the weight of 8 generations settling on her shoulders, not crushing, but grounding. Purpose she'd never imagined having. The grove shimmered back to normal October morning, but everything had changed. She could feel the chasm beneath her feet now, sense the patient malevolence of things that had waited millennia for their chance at freedom. Her greatest fear had never been death. It had been insignificance. "Tell me what I need to do," she said. Sarah's ancient eyes brightened with something that might have been relief. "The ritual requires preparation. 3 days of fasting and meditation to align your life force with the barriers. Then, at the moment of greatest need, you place your hands upon the binding stones and—" A sound cut through her explanation, a deep, resonant crack like thunder, but wrong. It came from below, from the chasm Eleanor could no longer see but still felt pressing against the soles of her feet. The oak trees shuddered, their leaves rustling in wind that touched nothing else. Sarah's composure shattered. "No, it's too soon. The barriers shouldn't—" Another crack, louder this time. The stone table split down its center, symbols flaring bright before going dark forever. Eleanor felt Frank's hand torn from hers as the ground beneath them lurched. Not earthquake motion, but something far worse. The sensation of a foundation giving way. "Sarah, what's happening?" Eleanor's voice came out higher than she intended. But Sarah wasn't Sarah anymore. The woman who had guided them with such careful patience was transforming, her human facade falling away in pieces. Her skin grew translucent, revealing patterns of light beneath that pulsed in rhythm with the cracks in the earth. When she spoke, her voice layered with harmonies that made Eleanor's teeth ache. "The binding stones." Jeremiah moved them. Before he disappeared, he moved the primary anchors. Horror transformed Sarah's face into something terrible and beautiful. He was trying to strengthen them, but he didn't understand the pattern. "The configuration is wrong." A third crack, and this time Eleanor saw it. A fissure of absolute darkness splitting the air itself 6 feet away from her. Through the gap came a sound like breathing, but vast beyond any living creature. Something pressed against the opening from the other side, testing. "The barriers are cascading," Sarah said, her voice now barely human. "Complete failure. I cannot stop it alone." Eleanor felt the plan she'd just begun to form. 3 days of preparation, careful ritual, gradual assumption of responsibility, crumble like paper in flame. Then tell me how to help. Now, you're not ready. The ritual requires preparation, alignment. There is no time for preparation. Eleanor stepped toward the growing fissure, driven by instinct she didn't recognize. "Tell me what to do, or watch everything fall apart while we discuss proper procedure." Sarah's transformed face contorted with anguish. "The emergency binding. Direct life force transfer without safeguards. Eleanor, it will take years from you. Decades. And if you're not strong enough—" She didn't need to finish. Eleanor could see the alternative spreading before them, the crack widening, more fissures opening, ancient horrors pouring into a world that had no defenses against them. She thought of her quiet neighborhood in Omaha, of the librarians who would arrive Monday morning to find her desk empty, never knowing that civilization itself had ended because she chose caution over courage. "Show me how," Eleanor said. Frank grabbed her arm. "Ellie, no, there has to be another way." She turned to face him, memorizing the face she'd loved for 45 years. "Frank, if I don't do this, there won't be a world left for us to grow old in together. Then let someone else." "There is no one else." The truth hit her with crystalline clarity. "This is why I'm here. This is why my whole life has been pointing toward this moment." A fourth crack split the air, and through the expanding fissure came something worse than sound or sight. A pressure against her mind, vast intelligence pressing against the barriers of her thoughts. The old ones weren't just escaping their physical prison. They were reaching for her consciousness itself. Sarah grabbed Eleanor's hands, her touch burning like ice. "Place your palms on the broken stone. Channel everything you have into the binding pattern. But Eleanor, once you begin, you cannot stop. The drain will continue until the barriers hold or until I die." Eleanor looked at the shattered table, its ruined symbols still flickering with fading power. I understand. She moved toward the stone, each step feeling like walking through deep water. Behind her, Frank called her name with a desperation that nearly broke her resolve. Ahead, the fissures spread like cracks in breaking glass, and through them pressed shapes that should not exist. Eleanor placed her palms against the broken stone. The drain began immediately, not painful, but inexorable, like a river flowing backward through her veins. She felt her life force rushing out, decades of accumulated energy pouring into barriers that had already failed. The fissures slowed their expansion but didn't close. It's not enough, Sarah said, her voice thick with grief. The damage is too extensive. Eleanor, I'm sorry. Eleanor felt herself aging in real time. Her hair whitening, her back bending, her hands becoming gnarled against the stone. She was giving everything, and it wasn't enough. The old ones pressed closer to freedom, and her strength poured away like water through a broken dam. But as Eleanor felt her essence drain away, something unexpected began to happen. The ancient energies flowing through her weren't just her own, they were awakening memories embedded in her bloodline itself, generations of knowledge crystallizing in her fading consciousness like frost forming on glass. She could feel them now. Her great-great-grandmother Sarah, standing at this same stone during a blizzard in 1847, pouring her life into barriers that held. Margaret Whitmore in 1823, bleeding from wounds inflicted by escaped horrors, forcing them back through sheer will. Before her, Elizabeth and Catherine, and others whose names had been lost but whose sacrifice lived on in the very structure of the binding. You're not alone, Eleanor gasped, understanding flooding through her like revelation. None of us ever were. The broken stone beneath her hands wasn't just a ritual focus. It was a repository. Every guardian who had ever stood here had left something of herself behind, not just as an echo but as a reservoir. Eleanor had been trying to repair the barriers with her own strength alone, but the true pattern required connection to the accumulated power of 8 generations. Sarah? Eleanor called through gritted teeth, her voice stronger despite her aging body. The pattern isn't individual sacrifice, it's cumulative legacy. Help me reach them. Sarah's transformed face showed bewilderment, then dawning comprehension. The collective binding. It was theoretical. No one has attempted it since the original construction. Then it's time to make theory into practice. Eleanor shifted her grip on the broken stone, no longer trying to force her energy into predetermined channels, but instead opening herself to the patterns her ancestors had carved into the very foundation of this place. The change was immediate and overwhelming. Voices flooded her consciousness, not whispers from beyond, but memories made manifest. Her great-great-grandmother's voice, strong with prairie steel. The burden shared is a burden doubled, child. Margaret's laugh, bitter but determined. They think patience makes them wise. They haven't met stubborn. More than voices, knowledge. The true configuration of the binding stones, hidden for generations in case the primary anchors were discovered. The secondary pattern Jeremiah had never known existed, designed specifically for collective casting. Emergency protocols that required not one guardian's death, but the willing participation of all who had come before. Eleanor felt her aging body stabilize, the drain of energy becoming focused rather than desperate. Through her connection to the stone, she reached for Frank's hand. I need you, she told him. Not as a guardian, as an anchor. Something to keep me tethered to the living world while I work with the dead. Frank's warm, familiar touch grounded her instantly, providing a conduit back to her own time and place, while her consciousness worked alongside her ancestors. Through their combined knowledge, she could finally see the binding pattern as it truly was, not a prison but a transformation chamber, slowly converting the old one's malevolent energy into something the earth itself could absorb and neutralize. The process was never meant to be maintained indefinitely, Eleanor realized aloud. It was meant to be completed. The guardians were buying time for the conversion to finish. Sarah moved to the other side of the broken table. her transformed hands weaving patterns that complemented Eleanor's efforts. 200 years of gradual transformation. Eleanor, if you're right, if the process is nearly complete, then this failure might be exactly what we need, a controlled release that allows the final stage. Eleanor felt the fissures in the air shifting, their chaotic expansion becoming structured, purposeful. The old ones pressing against the barriers weren't just seeking escape, they were being drawn into a pattern that would remake their fundamental nature, but the process required perfect timing and absolute precision. "The children at the corn maze," Eleanor said suddenly, understanding rushing through her. "They're not in danger from the Watchers, they're part of the pattern. Innocent life force to balance the transformation." Horror crossed Frank's face. "Ellie, what are you saying?" "Not sacrifice," Eleanor clarified, her voice gaining strength as the collective knowledge of her bloodline flowed through her. "Witness. The process requires observation by those with no stake in the outcome. Children see clearly because they don't yet know what's impossible." Through her connection to the stone, Eleanor could sense the corn maze half a mile away, filled with families enjoying a perfect autumn afternoon. Their laughter and joy created a counterpoint to the ancient malevolence being transformed beneath their feet. Light and dark, innocence and corruption, held in perfect balance. The broken stone began to warm beneath her hands. The fissures in the air started closing, but not sealing, transforming. What had been tears in reality became windows, and through them poured not escape but completion. Eleanor felt the exact moment when 2 centuries of patient work reached fruition. The old one's hunger became fuel for growth rather than destruction. Their ancient intelligence became wisdom rather than predation. Their vast power became part of the land itself, ready to nurture rather than consume. She understood now why her bloodline had been chosen for this responsibility. Not because they were strong enough to fight such beings, but because they were wise enough to transform them. The revelation changed everything. The transformation rippled outward from the grove like water finding its level, and Eleanor felt the weight of 2 centuries lifting from the land itself. The broken stone beneath her hands grew warm, then hot, then settled into a gentle pulse that matched her heartbeat. The fissures in the air weren't closing. They were becoming something else entirely, windows that showed glimpses of what the farm could become. Through the transformed barriers, Eleanor caught flashes of vision, corn that grew in perfect spirals, reaching heights that defied physics while feeding soil that had never known depletion. Orchards bearing fruit in every season, their roots drawing from the converted power of beings older than human civilization. Water that healed, earth that sang, air that carried whispers of wisdom rather than malice. "It's beautiful," Frank breathed beside her, and Eleanor realized he could see it too, not through bloodline connection, but through simple proximity to the transformation itself. Sarah's luminous form began to solidify, her ancient features settling into something more recognizably human. The process is stabilizing, 200 years of accumulated power finally finding its proper form. She looked at Eleanor with something approaching wonder. "You've done what 8 generations couldn't accomplish alone." Eleanor felt herself changing, but not aging now, strengthening. The collective knowledge of her ancestors had become permanently available, not as foreign memories, but as integrated wisdom. She knew which stones anchored the eastern boundary, could sense the exact moment when the corn would be ready for harvest, understood the migration patterns of every creature that called this land home. "The Watchers," Eleanor said, suddenly understanding their final transformation. "They're not echoes anymore." Through her expanded awareness, she could feel them. Her great-great-grandmother Sarah and all the others, no longer trapped in endless guardianship, but free to move through the land as its willing protectors. They had become part of something larger than individual sacrifice, a collective consciousness that would ensure the farm's true purpose could finally flourish. Frank squeezed her hand tighter. "What does this mean for us? For our life?" Eleanor looked at him, seeing not just her husband of 45 years, but her partner in something unprecedented. "It means we're not guardians anymore, Frank. We're stewards. The farm doesn't need us to sacrifice ourselves to maintain prison walls. It needs us to learn how to work with what it's becoming." The implications were staggering. No more desperate rituals, no more aging guardians pouring their lives into failing barriers. Instead, they could focus on understanding the converted energies, learning to channel the old one's transformed power into healing rather than mere containment. The other families who entered the raffle, Eleanor realized, they weren't random either, were they? You've been gathering people with the right qualities, the right openness to possibility. Sarah nodded. Jeremiah's disappearance created a crisis, but also an opportunity. We could continue the old pattern of isolated guardianship, or we could try something that had never been attempted, a community of stewards working together. Eleanor felt her perspective expanding beyond the grove, beyond the farm itself. She could sense other places like this one, scattered across the continent, sites where ancient powers had been imprisoned rather than transformed, where lonely guardians still fought battles that could be won rather than merely maintained. There are others, she said, other farms, other bloodlines still trapped in the old patterns. 17 sites remain active, Sarah confirmed. Most of their guardians don't even know about each other. The isolation was considered necessary for security. Frank stood straighter beside Eleanor, and she felt his decision forming before he spoke it aloud. Then, we teach them. Show them what you've accomplished here. Eleanor squeezed his hand, love and gratitude flowing through her, like the transformed energies that now pulsed through the farm's foundation. After 45 years of marriage, they were beginning their greatest adventure together. Not immediately, Eleanor said. Practical considerations asserting themselves alongside cosmic revelations. We need to understand our own transformation first, learn how to work with these new capabilities, build something sustainable before we try to teach others. The broken stone beneath her hands finally cooled to normal temperature, its surface now smooth and whole despite the cracks she could still see. The grove around them looked exactly as it had that first morning when they'd discovered it, but Eleanor's enhanced awareness could perceive layers of meaning in every detail. The corn maze families, Frank said suddenly. They're still out there, still part of this somehow. Eleanor nodded, feeling their distant presence like points of warmth in her consciousness. They'll leave with stories about the most perfectly maintained farm they've ever seen, the sweetest corn they've ever tasted. Some of their children will remember more. Will grow up knowing that impossible things can become beautiful things if you're willing to look beyond the surface. She stood slowly, testing her transformed relationship with her own body. The aging from the emergency ritual had stabilized, leaving her perhaps 5 years older, but immeasurably stronger. More importantly, she could feel the land itself supporting her, ready to share its accumulated wisdom whenever she needed guidance. They had work to do. The work began immediately, though it bore no resemblance to the desperate rituals that had defined this place for 2 centuries. Eleanor found herself drawn not to the ancient stone table, but to the practical needs of the transformed farm, checking on the families still enjoying the corn maze, ensuring the conversion of power hadn't left any dangerous instabilities, beginning to understand what stewardship actually meant in practice. The Hendersons' youngest daughter can see them, Eleanor told Frank as they walked back toward the farmhouse, her enhanced awareness tracking the family's progress through the maze. The watchers. She's pointing and waving at empty air, but it's not empty anymore. Frank paused, concern crossing his weathered features. Should we be worried about that? No. Eleanor's certainty surprised her, but the collective wisdom of her bloodline confirmed her instinct. She's seeing what the watchers have become, protectors rather than prisoners. Children often can, until adults teach them not to trust their eyes. They found Jeremiah's journal still open on the kitchen table where Eleanor had left it that first morning, his final entry about the right people coming home now carrying weight she couldn't have imagined then. She traced the words with her finger, feeling an echo of his relief at finally being able to let go of a burden too large for one person to bear. He knew, she murmured. At the end, he understood that the old pattern was breaking down not because he was failing, but because it was time for something better. Frank settled beside her at the table, his practical nature asserting itself. So what does something better actually look like day to day? We can't exactly put transformed ancient powers on our tax returns." Eleanor laughed, the sound carrying more joy than she'd felt in months. "We're farmers now, Frank. Really farmers. We grow things, we tend the land, we figure out how to make this place sustainable." She gestured toward the window, where the corn maze stretched out in perfect geometric patterns. "Except now we're doing it with resources that would have seemed like magic 6 months ago." The afternoon light slanted through the kitchen window, illuminating Jeremiah's careful notes about crop rotation and soil composition. But Eleanor's enhanced perception could read between the lines now, seeing the deeper patterns he'd documented, which fields responded best to direct energy infusion, where the converted power pooled naturally, how the farm's rhythm aligned with larger cycles of transformation. "The autumn harvest," Eleanor said suddenly, understanding flooding through her. "It's not just crops. The conversion process peaks with the seasonal turn. That's why the families are here now, why everything had to happen today." Through the window, she could see the last groups beginning to emerge from the corn maze, their faces bright with the kind of joy that came from perfect autumn afternoons. But more than that, she could sense the subtle changes in them, the way their brief contact with transformed power had planted seeds of possibility in their minds. "They'll go home different," Eleanor realized. "Not transformed like us, but opened, ready to see beyond the surface of things." Frank stood and walked to the window, watching a father lift his daughter onto his shoulders so she could see over the corn. "Is that part of the plan? Creating more people who can accept the impossible?" "Not a plan," Eleanor corrected, feeling the distinction clearly. "A natural consequence. The farm doesn't need to hide anymore, Frank. It needs to demonstrate what's possible when ancient power serves life instead of fighting it." The implications were both thrilling and terrifying. No more careful secrecy, no more isolated guardianship, but also no more safety in obscurity. If they were going to help other sites break free of the old patterns, they'd need to become teachers, guides, examples of what successful transformation could accomplish. Eleanor felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, but it was different from the crushing burden she'd sensed in Sarah's memories. This was weight that could be shared, work that would multiply rather than diminish as others joined them. "The other 17 sites," she said, thinking aloud. "Some of their guardians will resist change. 2 centuries of tradition, of believing that sacrifice and secrecy are the only way to keep humanity safe." "Then we prove them wrong," Frank replied with quiet certainty. "We make this place into something so obviously better that they can't ignore the possibility." Eleanor reached for his hand, feeling the solid reality of their partnership anchor her to the present moment. They were no longer the retired librarian and insurance adjuster who'd won an impossible raffle 3 days ago, but they were still themselves, practical, stubborn, devoted to each other and to doing the right thing even when it was difficult. Outside, the last families were loading into their cars, taking with them memories of the most perfect farm they'd ever visited. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions about how to balance their transformed reality with the mundane requirements of property taxes and agricultural regulations. But tonight, Eleanor thought, as she squeezed Frank's hand, they would rest in the knowledge that they had chosen correctly when the moment came. They had committed themselves to finishing what 8 generations of guardians had started. The final confrontation, not with ancient enemies, but with those who would resist change, was coming. Eleanor woke before dawn to find Frank already dressed, standing at the bedroom window with the stillness of a man bracing for battle. 3 weeks had passed since the transformation, 3 weeks of learning to work with energies that defied every law of physics they'd once accepted. The farm had flourished beyond imagination, crops growing with impossible vigor, soil that seemed to heal itself overnight, water that ran clearer than mountain springs. But this morning felt different, wrong. "They're here," Frank said without turning from the window. Eleanor joined him, her enhanced awareness immediately sensing what had disturbed his sleep. 3 black sedans were parked along the county road, their occupants radiating the kind of focused attention that came from professional surveillance. But beneath that surface threat, she felt something more complex, a mixture of fear, desperation, and the distinctive energy signature of people carrying burdens too heavy to bear alone. Guardians, she realized, from the other sites. Through her connection to the transformed land, Eleanor could feel them more clearly now. 7 individuals, each carrying the weight of centuries-old responsibilities, each aging under the strain of maintaining barriers that grew weaker every year. They had come not as enemies exactly, but as protectors of a system they couldn't imagine changing. "Mrs. Whitmore," the voice carried across the morning air with unnatural clarity. "We need to speak with you." Eleanor dressed quickly, her mind racing through the implications. For 3 weeks they had worked in relative isolation, learning to understand their new reality without external pressure, but the transformation of their site had sent ripples through whatever network connected the 17 remaining locations. Other guardians would have felt the shift, would have had to investigate what appeared to be a catastrophic failure of containment. They gathered in the kitchen, Eleanor and Frank on one side of the table, 7 strangers on the other. The visitors ranged in age from a woman who looked barely 40 to a man whose hands shook with the tremors of someone who had given decades to his burden. Each carried artifacts Eleanor could now recognize: binding stones, focus crystals, items of power worn smooth by generations of desperate use. "You have no idea what you've done," said the eldest, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "The barriers you've compromised, the protections you've abandoned. The Wilson site in Montana detected massive energy fluctuations 3 weeks ago. The Henderson farmstead in Georgia has been experiencing breakthrough attempts ever since." Eleanor felt Frank tense beside her, but she remained calm. Through her connection to the land, she could sense the truth beneath their accusations. Fear, yes, but also exhaustion. These people were dying by degrees, pouring their lives into a system that demanded everything and offered no hope of resolution. "Show me," Eleanor said simply. The eldest guardian, Marcus, she sensed his name, pulled a crystal from his pocket. It pulsed with sickly yellow light, its surface crawling with fracture patterns that spoke of barely contained catastrophe. "This is what's left of our primary anchor stone. 40 years I've been feeding my life force into keeping those cracks from spreading. 40 years of watching it get worse, knowing that when I die, my daughter will have to take my place." Eleanor reached for the crystal, ignoring the sharp intake of breath from around the table. The moment her fingers made contact, she felt the familiar sensation of ancient malevolence pressing against weakening barriers. But she also felt something the guardians had missed, the same potential for transformation that had saved their own site. "You're fighting the wrong battle," Eleanor said gently, her awareness expanding to encompass the patterns of power flowing through Marcus's crystal. "You're trying to maintain a prison when you should be facilitating a conversion." "Conversion is impossible," snapped the youngest guardian, a woman whose premature gray hair spoke of years beyond her apparent age. "We've tried everything. The old ones can't be reasoned with, can't be changed, they can only be contained." Eleanor exchanged glances with Frank, seeing her own determination reflected in his eyes. This was the moment they had been preparing for, consciously or not. The ultimate test of everything they had learned, everything they had become. "Then let me show you what's possible," Eleanor said, standing slowly. "Let me show you what this place has become." She led them outside, where the morning sun revealed the farm in all its transformed glory. Corn that grew in perfect spirals, reaching impossible heights, while roots that glowed faintly in her enhanced vision drew sustenance from converted power instead of depleted soil. The air itself felt different here, cleaner, more alive, charged with potential rather than barely contained malevolence. "The old ones aren't your enemies," Eleanor explained as understanding dawned on several faces. "They're your raw materials. 200 years of patient work, slowly converting hunger into fertility, predation into protection." She could see the moment when each guardian began to truly comprehend what they were seeing. Hope warred with ingrained desperation. Possibility fought against generations of learned helplessness. The final test had begun. But Marcus stepped forward, his weathered hands clenching the fractured crystal until blood seeped between his fingers. "Impossible," he snarled. and Eleanor felt the killing intent radiating from him like heat from a forge. 2 centuries of my bloodline have died maintaining the barriers. You would make their sacrifice meaningless with your naive fantasies. The crystal in his grip flared with poisonous light, and Eleanor suddenly understood the true danger. He wasn't just rejecting her demonstration, he was preparing to shatter the conversion entirely, to release the raw malevolence of his own sight directly into her transformed sanctuary. Marcus, don't! The youngest guardian reached for him, but she was too late. The crystal exploded outward in a burst of corrupted energy that struck the heart of Eleanor's farm like acid thrown on living flesh. She screamed as the converted power recoiled, the delicate balance of transformation wavering under the assault of pure, unconverted hunger. Through the land itself, Eleanor felt the old ones beneath her farm responding to the attack. But instead of the protective response she expected, they began to revert. 2 centuries of patient conversion unraveling as Marcus's unleashed malevolence reminded them of what they had been, what they could become again. Frank! Eleanor reached for her husband as the ground beneath them began to crack, revealing the sickly glow of awakening predators. The careful spirals of her corn maze twisted into chaotic tangles, the crops themselves becoming weapons as ancient hunger reclaimed them. Frank caught her hand just as the earth opened beneath their feet. Around them, the visiting guardians scattered, some fleeing toward their vehicles while others stood their ground with artifacts blazing. But Eleanor barely saw them. Her entire focus was on the presence rising from the depths of her land, the collective consciousness she had thought transformed, now roaring with renewed appetite for living flesh. You see? Marcus laughed, blood streaming down his face from the crystal's backlash. This is what your conversion really accomplished. You didn't change them, you just made them patient enough to fool you. Eleanor felt the truth of his words like a physical blow. The memories flooding through her enhanced awareness showed the real scope of the old one's deception. They had allowed the conversion, had participated in it willingly, because they had sensed something her human perception had missed, the network connecting all 17 sites, the possibility of using one transformed location as a gateway to corrupt the others. The farm families. Eleanor's heart lurched as she realized how completely she had been manipulated. All those children who had come into contact with the converted power, all those parents who had left with seeds of openness in their minds, they weren't carriers of possibility. They were infection vectors for an intelligence that had spent 2 centuries learning exactly how to appear benevolent. The other sites, she gasped, feeling the corruption spreading outward through connections she had helped establish. They're all linked. The transformations, the weakness in the barriers. A coordinated attack. The youngest guardian confirmed grimly, her own artifacts flaring as she fought to contain the spreading contamination. They used your success to convince us that change was possible, made us lower our defenses while they prepared to break free everywhere at once. Frank pulled Eleanor back from the widening chasm in their farmyard, but there was nowhere to run. The corruption was spreading faster than they could move, turning everything it touched into extensions of an alien will that had never been tamed, only temporarily patient. Eleanor felt her enhanced awareness expanding beyond her control, forcing her to witness the scope of the catastrophe she had enabled. 17 sites across the continent, all simultaneously experiencing containment failures as the old ones revealed the true extent of their coordination. Guardians dying as their life-depleted barriers finally collapsed, ancient hungers rousing from centuries of enforced dormancy. But in the midst of her horror, Eleanor sensed something else, a flicker of genuine resistance from deep within her own land's foundation. Not from the old ones she had thought converted, but from something older still, the original power that had drawn her bloodline to this place, the source that had made the prison possible in the first place. Her ancestors hadn't just been guardians, she realized. They had been wielders of something the old ones feared. Frank, she said urgently, understanding flooding through her as the ground continued to crack around them. The grove, the original altar stone. It's not part of their prison. It's what created the prison. Through the chaos of spreading corruption and panicking guardians, Eleanor felt the presence of 8 generations of her bloodline calling to her. Not from memory this time, but from whatever realm they had passed to after their sacrificial deaths. They had been waiting for this moment, she realized, the final confrontation that would determine whether humanity's ancient enemies would finally break free or face the one power they couldn't corrupt, couldn't deceive, couldn't outlast. The power of willing sacrifice freely given. The ultimate price had always been demanded, not by the old ones, but by the force that could truly destroy them. Eleanor felt the weight of 8 generations settling into her bones as she ran toward the grove, Frank's hand tight in hers. Behind them the farm writhed in its death throes, corn stalks reaching like grasping fingers, soil bubbling with ancient malevolence, the very air thick with the hunger of things that had waited 2 centuries for this moment of freedom. But ahead, through the chaos, the altar stone blazed with clean white light. "Eleanor, no!" Marcus's voice cracked across the farmyard, his bloodied face twisted with desperate understanding. "The ritual requires a life willingly given. That's why your bloodline kept returning. Someone always had to die to reset the bindings." She knew. Through the connection to her ancestors, Eleanor had felt the echo of their final moments. 8 generations of Whitmores who had faced this same choice, who had walked to that stone knowing they would never leave it. The power that could truly destroy the old ones demanded the ultimate price, a life freely sacrificed, given not from despair but from love. "There has to be another way," Frank gasped as they reached the grove's edge. The ancient oaks towered around them, their leaves rustling with voices Eleanor almost recognized. "Eleanor, we'll find another way." "There is no other way." Eleanor turned to face her husband, memorizing every line of his beloved face while the world crumbled around them. "This is why we were brought here, Frank. Why we won that raffle. Why the farm chose us. Not for conversion or compromise, but for completion." Through her enhanced awareness, she could feel the 17 sites across the continent, all simultaneously experiencing their final moments. Guardians making their last stands, barriers crumbling, ancient hungers preparing to feast on a world that had forgotten how to protect itself, unless someone paid the price that would end it forever. Frank's face went white with understanding. "No, Eleanor, no. 40 years of marriage, I won't let you—" "You're not letting me do anything," Eleanor said gently, pressing her palm against his cheek. "This is my choice, my bloodline's responsibility. The power that created the original bindings, it's not gone, Frank. It's been waiting for someone strong enough to use it properly, not to imprison them again, but to unmake them entirely." She could see the moment when Frank understood the true scope of what she was offering. Not just her life, but the complete destruction of threats that had plagued humanity since before recorded history. The altar stone pulsed brighter, resonating with her decision, and Eleanor felt the presence of her ancestors, gathering around them like witnesses to a sacred act. "The cost," she whispered, her voice breaking as the full weight of sacrifice settled into her heart. "The cost isn't just dying, Frank. It's leaving you. It's breaking the promise we made to grow old together, to see what this place could become. It's all the years we'll never have, all the grandchildren we'll never spoil, all the quiet mornings we'll never share." Frank's hands framed her face, his own tears falling freely now. "Then don't. Please, Eleanor. There has to be something else we can sacrifice." "Love freely given," Eleanor said, understanding flooding through her as the words left her lips. "That's what makes the power clean. Not just my life, but my willingness to give up everything I value most. My time with you, our future, the life we built together." Behind them, the corruption had reached the grove's edge, turning the outer oaks into writhing masses of predatory wood and hunger. But here, in the circle around the altar stone, the light held them back, waiting for her decision. Eleanor walked to the stone, feeling the power thrumming through it like a heartbeat. 8 generations of her bloodline had made this walk, but none of them had possessed what she now carried, the absolute certainty that their sacrifice would mean permanent victory, not just another temporary binding. "I love you," she said to Frank, her voice carrying clearly despite the chaos around them. "I love you enough to leave you. I love humanity enough to end this forever. I love the future enough to ensure it exists." She placed her hands on the altar stone, feeling the clean power flow into her like liquid starlight. Through it, she sensed the 17 sights, felt the old one's confidence wavering as they realized what was happening. They had counted on her attachment to life, on human selfishness, on the inability to make the ultimate sacrifice willingly and completely. They had miscalculated the depth of human love. Eleanor looked back once at Frank, memorizing his face, then opened herself completely to the power that would consume her and, through her willing sacrifice, finally destroy the ancient enemies of everything she held dear. The light blazed brighter, preparing to cleanse the world of shadows that had haunted it for millennia. The price of victory was everything she valued most. She paid it gladly. The light consumed everything. Frank felt Eleanor's presence expand beyond the boundaries of flesh, beyond the grove, beyond comprehension itself. Through their joined hands, he experienced a moment of perfect connection, not just to his wife, but to the vast network of power flowing outward from the altar stone like ripples on an infinite pond. Across the continent, 17 sights blazed with the same clean radiance. Frank witnessed through Eleanor's expanded consciousness as ancient hungers that had plagued humanity for millennia simply ceased, not banished or imprisoned again, but unmade at their fundamental level. The old one's essence dissolved like shadows at noon, their malevolence converted into pure energy that scattered harmlessly into the earth. Then Eleanor's hand grew cold in his, and the light faded. Frank knelt beside the altar stone, cradling his wife's still form against his chest. She looked peaceful, younger somehow, as if the years of carrying an inherited burden had finally lifted from her features. Around them, the grove stood silent, no longer charged with ancient power, but simply a circle of old oaks on a Nebraska farm. The transformation was immediate and total. Where corrupted corn had writhed moments before, Frank saw ordinary stalks bending in a natural wind. The cracks in the earth had sealed themselves, leaving behind rich, dark soil that smelled of rain and growing things. Even the air felt different, lighter, cleaner, free from the oppressive weight that had pressed down on this place for centuries. Marcus approached slowly, his fractured crystal now dark and inert in his bloodied palm. The other guardians followed, their faces showing the same stunned recognition that Frank felt in his bones. After generations of fighting a war they could never truly win, the enemy had simply vanished. "It's over," Marcus whispered, his voice hollow with disbelief. "I can feel it, all of them, everywhere, gone." Frank nodded wordlessly, unable to speak past the crushing weight in his chest. Victory felt like ashes in his mouth when the price had been everything that mattered. Eleanor's sacrifice had saved the world, but Frank's world had died with her. The youngest guardian, Sarah, Frank remembered, knelt beside him with tears streaming down her face. "The sights," she said softly. "They're all just normal places now, farms and forests and empty fields. My children won't have to inherit this burden. No one's children will." More people arrived throughout the day, guardians from the other sites, drawn by whatever final signal Eleanor's sacrifice had sent through their network. They came expecting catastrophe and found instead the unprecedented, absolute resolution. Some wept openly, overcome by relief they had never allowed themselves to hope for. Others stood in shocked silence, struggling to comprehend a world without the ancient threat that had defined their bloodline's purpose for centuries. Frank barely registered their presence. He sat in the grove as the afternoon shadows lengthened, holding Eleanor's hand and trying to process a future that stretched before him, empty of everything that had given it meaning. 40 years of marriage, of shared jokes and comfortable silences, of growing old together, all sacrificed for the salvation of people he would never meet. As sunset approached, Marcus finally found the courage to interrupt Frank's vigil. "She saved us all," he said simply. "Every guardian family, every child who would have inherited our burden. She freed us from a cycle that has consumed hundreds of lives over the centuries." "I know," Frank replied, his voice barely audible. She knew too. That's why she could do it, because she understood exactly what it would cost, and she paid it anyway. The other guardians had begun making arrangements, calling authorities who would need believable explanations, contacting family members who had lived their entire lives under the shadow of inherited duty, beginning the complex process of reclaiming normal existence. But Frank couldn't imagine participating in that future. Without Eleanor, the prospect of tomorrow felt impossibly vast and meaningless. Sarah touched his shoulder gently. "What will you do now?" Frank looked around the grove, seeing it truly for the first time since the morning's chaos. Just trees and grass and fading light, beautiful in its ordinary simplicity. Eleanor had loved this place, had seen its potential for peace rather than power. "I'll stay," he said finally. This was her home, the first place she ever felt she truly belonged. I think she'd want someone to tend her garden, to make sure the farm remembers what it was supposed to become." As the last guardian vehicles disappeared down the dirt road, Frank remained in the grove with his wife's body, watching stars emerge in a sky that no longer held ancient malevolence. The silence felt different now, not oppressive, but restful. The kind of quiet Eleanor had always loved, when the world paused between one breath and the next. Tomorrow would bring questions, arrangements, the terrible practicalities of life after loss. But tonight, Frank simply sat with his wife under the Nebraska stars, grateful that her last conscious act had been one of love rather than duty, sacrifice rather than surrender. She had chosen to save the world. The world would have to learn to be worthy of that gift. Chapter 17, The Return. 6 months later, Frank stood in the same grove where he had lost everything and gained an understanding he never wanted to possess. The altar stone remained, but it no longer hummed with ancient power, just weathered granite that caught the morning light like any ordinary rock. Eleanor's grave lay beside it, marked with a simple headstone that bore only her name and dates. The inscription she would have wanted was too dangerous to carve in stone. She chose love over fear. The farm had transformed in ways that still surprised him. Without the old one's influence, the land responded to ordinary care with extraordinary abundance. His tomatoes grew fat and sweet, the corn stood in neat rows that swayed with natural wind, and Eleanor's herb garden flourished with plants that smelled of summer rather than ancient secrets. Visitors often commented on the peaceful atmosphere, never suspecting that this ordinary Nebraska farm had once been the epicenter of humanity's salvation. Frank had learned to navigate the questions with careful truth. Eleanor had died of a heart attack while they were exploring their unexpected inheritance. The previous owner's disappearance remained a mystery, though Frank now suspected Jeremiah Thorne had somehow sensed what was coming and fled before the final confrontation. The official records showed an elderly couple who had won a farm and lost each other to the cruel mathematics of age and stress. Only a few people knew the real story. Sarah visited every month, bringing news from the network of former guardian families. The adjustment to normal life proved challenging for people who had spent generations preparing for supernatural threats. Some struggled with the sudden absence of purpose, while others embraced mundane concerns with desperate relief. Children who should have inherited terrible burdens instead worried about college applications and summer jobs. The Kowalski family opened a bakery in Denver, Sarah reported during her April visit, sitting beside Eleanor's grave, as had become their custom. 3 generations of guardians, and now they make the most incredible sourdough bread. Their youngest daughter doesn't even know what they used to guard against. Frank nodded, pulling weeds from around the headstone. These conversations helped, evidence that Eleanor's sacrifice had created space for ordinary happiness. The weight of her absence hadn't lessened, but it had evolved into something he could carry alongside grief. Marcus came less frequently, still processing his own transformation from warrior to retiree. His family's artifacts had become inert museum pieces, their supernatural properties vanished along with the entities they had been designed to combat. He struggled more than the others, having invested 70 years in a battle that no longer existed. "I dream about her sometimes," he confessed during his spring visit. "Not nightmares, just conversations. She tells me the price was worth paying because it bought something impossible, an ending." He paused, studying the peaceful grove. Do you think she knew? Really knew what would happen when she touched that stone? Frank had wrestled with the same question through countless sleepless nights. She knew enough, he said finally. She understood the cost and chose to pay it anyway. That's the only part that matters. The isolation Frank had expected never materialized. Word of the farm's remarkable productivity spread through the community, bringing neighbors who offered help and friendship without ulterior motives. He found himself hosting church potlucks and harvest celebrations, the grove serving as a natural gathering place that somehow encouraged peace rather than the unease it had once generated. Mrs. Henderson from the adjacent property became a regular visitor, bringing casseroles and taking home vegetables in an exchange that felt both generous and practical. She never asked pointed questions about Eleanor's death or Frank's decision to remain alone on such a large property. Rural communities understood grief and respected the healing power of useful work, but it was the children who proved most transformative. Sarah's daughter Emma, now 12, treated the farm as an adventure rather than a burden. She helped Frank with planting and weeding, chattering about school projects and friend drama while they worked. Her presence filled spaces in the farmhouse that had remained silent since Eleanor's death, bringing laughter that felt both foreign and necessary. "Grandpa Frank," she said one afternoon, having adopted the title without asking permission. "Mom says this place used to be scary, but it doesn't feel scary at all." "No," Frank agreed, watching her braid dandelion stems into crowns. "It feels like what it was always supposed to be." Other guardian children visited during summer breaks, their families maintaining connections forged through shared danger but sustained by something more valuable, the knowledge that they had survived together. The farm became an informal reunion site, a place where people could acknowledge their extraordinary past while building ordinary futures. Frank aged into his role as keeper of transformed ground. His hair went completely white, his movements grew more careful, but his purpose remained clear. He tended Eleanor's garden, maintained their home, and helped former enemies learn to be neighbors instead of threats. On quiet evenings, he still sat beside her grave and reported the day's small victories. The successful harvest, the neighbor's recovered health, the letter from a guardian family whose children had never learned to fear the dark. "We did something impossible," he would whisper to the gathering dusk. "We chose hope over hatred, love over legacy. The world had learned to be worthy of her gift." Chapter 18, The New Beginning. 5 years had passed since those whispered conversations with gathering dusk. Frank's hair had gone from white to silver. His steps had slowed to match the measured pace of prairie seasons, but his daily rituals remained unchanged. Each morning began with coffee in Eleanor's favorite mug. Each evening ended with a few quiet words beside her headstone. The rhythm had become his prayer, his way of honoring both her sacrifice and the impossible peace it had purchased. The farm had evolved into something neither he nor Eleanor could have imagined during those early frightening days. What began as a supernatural inheritance had transformed into a genuine sanctuary, not from ancient evils that no longer existed, but from the ordinary troubles that still plagued human hearts. Word had spread, though Frank never quite understood how, that this Nebraska farm offered something rare, genuine rest for people carrying burdens they couldn't name. Visitors arrived regularly now. Former guardians brought their families for reunions that felt more like pilgrimages, standing in the grove where their centuries-long vigil had finally ended. But others came too, strangers who had heard rumors about a place where stressed executives found perspective, where grieving parents discovered comfort, where anyone carrying invisible weight could set it down for a while. Frank welcomed them all with Eleanor's hospitality, offering guest rooms to those who needed them and simple conversation to those who preferred silence. He had become, without planning it, exactly what Eleanor had always been, someone who created space for healing. Emma, now 17 and preparing for college, still spent summers at the farm. She had grown tall and serious, carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had watched adults transform pain into purpose. Frank treasured their morning conversations over coffee and fresh-baked bread, marveling at how normal her concerns were, scholarships and career plans, and whether the boy from her chemistry class would ask her to homecoming. "You know what I love most about this place?" she said one August morning, gesturing toward the grove where early sunlight filtered through healthy oak leaves. "It feels like a place where terrible things ended rather than where terrible things happened." Frank nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The grove held no residual darkness, no lingering sense of supernatural threat. Instead, it radiated the particular peace that comes only after great struggles reach resolution. Visitors often commented on feeling lighter after spending time there, though few understood why. The practical aspects of farm life had settled into sustainable patterns. Frank employed several local teenagers during harvest season, teaching them skills that had nothing to do with supernatural warfare and everything to do with ordinary stewardship. His vegetables won prizes at the county fair, his corn yielded exactly what the almanacs predicted, and his herb garden produced seasonings that flavored dozens of community meals throughout the year. But the most profound change was internal. The man who had once felt like an accidental participant in his own life had discovered unexpected depths of purpose. Eleanor's sacrifice had saved the world, but Frank's daily choice to honor that sacrifice by creating space for healing had saved him from drowning in grief. On this particular evening, as September light painted the grove in shades of gold and amber, Frank carried 2 cups of tea to Eleanor's grave, a habit he had maintained despite its apparent futility. He settled onto the wooden bench he had built beside her headstone and began his usual report. "Emma got into State University," he said, his voice carrying easily through the still air. "Full scholarship. She wants to study social work, says this place taught her that helping people find peace is the most important work there is." A breeze stirred the oak leaves, creating shadows that danced across the headstone's simple inscription. Frank had finally added the words he thought Eleanor would have wanted: "Beloved wife, who chose hope over fear." "Marcus is getting married next month," Frank continued, warming his hands around the teacup. 78 years old and finally brave enough to risk his heart on someone who has nothing to do with ancient mysteries. Sarah says the ceremony will be in his backyard garden, surrounded by tomatoes and completely ordinary magic. The ritual of these conversations had evolved over the years. What began as desperate attempts to maintain connection with his lost wife had become something more complex, a practice of gratitude, a way of measuring how far they had all traveled from those terrifying early days. "The world turned out worthy of your gift," Frank whispered, as full darkness settled around them. "Not perfect, not free from suffering, but worthy. Children grow up without inherited burdens. Families build futures based on love rather than duty. People find peace in ordinary places." He sat quietly for a long time, listening to the natural sounds of a Nebraska night. Wind through healthy corn, cattle settling in distant pastures, the soft hoot of an owl that hunted mice rather than ancient secrets. When Frank finally rose to return to the farmhouse, he carried both teacups with him. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new opportunities to offer the hospitality Eleanor had taught him, new chances to prove that her sacrifice had planted seeds of healing that would outlive them all. The farm had become their greatest collaboration, her courage transformed into his daily choice to create sanctuary from ordinary sorrow. Together, even across the impossible distance of death, they had built something lasting. Love, freely given, continued to work its quiet miracles.